What happens when loyalty becomes the most dangerous lie of all? For Gina Morelli, love was never meant to be a choice. She was raised among power, politics, and men who believed emotions were weaknesses. But the night she crossed paths with Alessandro Volkov, her father's most feared ally, the Russian Don who ruled Chicago's underworld with iron precision, everything changed. He was the man every rival feared, and every oath forbade her to touch. Yet beneath his ruthless control burned a secret hunger, one that would destroy them both. One rain-soaked night shattered the fragile line between loyalty and temptation, binding them to a sin they could never confess. This is a story of forbidden devotion, of a man haunted by guilt and a woman torn between love and survival. A tale where every glance is a risk, every silence a confession, and every choice a betrayal. So dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's step into a world where love isn't pure, it's dangerous. Comment with the emoji if you believe even the most forbidden love deserves a second chance. Subscribe for more cinematic stories of passion, power, and redemption. Because sometimes, the greatest danger isn't the enemy waiting outside. It's the one your heart refuses to forget. The cold Chicago rain lashed against the taxi window, turning the city lights into neon blurs. Gina paid the driver with trembling hands, the sound of coins dropping into her palm echoing the disorder in her chest. She didn't think about where to go. Her feet carried her to the one place that, in 21 years, had always represented a kind of untouchable fortress, the Volkov mansion. The heavy oak door opened before she even touched the bell. It was one of Alessandro's men, a silent giant whose name she never knew. He simply nodded, acknowledging her as Katerina's friend, and led her into the vast marble hall. The warmth and silence of the house enveloped her, but they brought no comfort. They brought a sense of emptiness. "Katerina?" Gina's voice came out weak, a wisp of sound swallowed by the grandeur of the place. The man shook his head. "Miss Volkov is out with friends." Of course she was. It was Friday. Gina felt a fresh wave of self-pity wash over her. Here she was, soaked, and with her makeup smudged, while the rest of the world moved on. She hugged herself, a futile gesture against the chill that came from within. Her intention was to turn around and face the rain again, but then she saw it. A line of golden light escaping from under the door of Alessandro Volkov's office. The office was a forbidden sanctuary. In all the years she had frequented the house, Gina had never set foot in it. It was the lion's den, the center of power for a man she respected, and, if she were honest with herself, feared. But today, the pain was louder than the fear. Driven by something she didn't understand, she walked to the door and knocked, her knuckles barely making a sound against the solid wood. The door swung open, and Gina's world stopped spinning. Alessandro Volkov wasn't just tall. He was imposing, a presence that filled the space and sucked the air out of it. He wore a dark suit without a tie, the top buttons of his shirt undone, revealing a sliver of tanned skin. His eyes, dark and piercing, sized her up from head to toe, taking in the wet hair, the smudged mascara, the tremor in her lips. He said nothing. He just watched her. Gina felt a hot blush creep up her neck. "I'm sorry, Mr. Volkov. I thought Katerina was here." He moved to the side, a silent invitation. "Come in, Gina." The sound of her name in his deep, velvety voice made her shiver. Hesitantly, she stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of leather, old paper, and the distant smoke of a cigar. A fireplace crackled in a corner, casting dancing shadows on the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, filled with volumes that looked as old as time itself. It was a room that exuded power. "Sit." It wasn't a request. She perched on the edge of a leather armchair that seemed too large for her. Alessandro poured himself a whiskey, the sound of the amber liquid hitting the ice, the only noise besides the rain and the fire. He held the glass out to her. "I don't drink." Gina took the heavy glass. The crystal was cold against her fingers. She took a sip, and the whiskey went down burning, a wave of heat that spread through her chest and loosened the knot in her throat. She coughed lightly. The shadow of a smile touched his lips, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He sat in the opposite armchair, watching her over the rim of his own glass. The silence stretched. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was an assessing one. Gina felt as if he could see right through her, straight to the fresh, pathetic wound in her heart. And then she started to talk. The words tumbled out, a torrent of humiliation about how her boyfriend had cheated on her with some random girl at a stupid party. It was a juvenile drama, an insignificant pain in the grand scheme of the world, especially in this man's world. And yet, he didn't interrupt her. He just listened, his gaze fixed on her, intense and unwavering. When she finished, the tears she had been holding back finally fell, hot and silent. She didn't sob. She just cried, feeling small and foolish. Alessandro leaned forward, setting his glass on the table. The movement was slow, deliberate. He knelt in front of her, pulling a silk handkerchief from his suit pocket. He didn't hand it to her. With a gentleness that contradicted his size and reputation, he wiped the tears from her face himself. The fabric was soft, but the skin of his knuckles brushed against her cheek. It was a fleeting, almost accidental touch, but it sent an electric shock through her entire body. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, startled rhythm. His scent enveloped her woody cologne, whiskey, and something else, something uniquely masculine and dangerous. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Gina saw something beyond the impenetrable dawn. She saw a flicker of something ancient, something weary. But there was something else there too, a dark intensity that made her hold her breath. His hand paused, hovering inches from her face, before he pulled it back abruptly, as if he had touched fire. He stood up, the distance between them safe again, the mask of control back in place. "Boys are fools," he said, his voice low and controlled. "To cry over one is a waste of your strength." The sentence wasn't kind, but it was solid. Real. It wasn't the empty comfort others would offer. It was a statement of fact from a man who likely didn't waste a second of his time on trivialities. And for some reason, that calmed her more than any hug could. Gina nodded, holding the whiskey glass with both hands, the cold of it anchoring her. "Thank you." "Don't thank me for the truth," he replied, moving back behind his imposing mahogany desk. He picked up some papers but didn't read them. His eyes were still on her. "Katerina speaks of you often. She says you see the world not as it is, but as it could be, through art." Gina was surprised that he knew that he remembered such a small detail. It's easier than looking at reality sometimes. "Reality always collects its price," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He looked at her, and for an instant, the office seemed to shrink. "Go home, Gina. Sleep. Tomorrow, the pain will be less." It was a dismissal. She knew it. She stood, feeling strangely steady. The whiskey, or perhaps his presence, had chased away the tremors. She placed the glass on the small table, the sound a soft click in the quiet room. "Thank you again, Mr. Volkov, for the whiskey, and for listening." She turned to leave, feeling the warmth of the fireplace on her back and the weight of his gaze. As her hand touched the cool brass doorknob, his voice stopped her. "Gina." She turned. He was standing, hands in his pockets, his silhouette framed against the fire. "He didn't deserve you." Her heart leaped. It wasn't what he said, but how he said it, with a final conviction, as if he were signing a sentence. She nodded, unable to speak, and left, closing the door behind her. In the silent hall, she finally released the breath she didn't know she'd been holding. The encounter had lasted no more than 15 minutes, but something had shifted. Her best friend's father was no longer just a distant, intimidating figure. He had shown her a fraction of himself, and in return, he had witnessed hers. As she waited for the taxi, one of Alessandro's men had called for her. Gina touched her own cheek. She could still feel the ghost of his touch, an invisible mark that burned hotter than the tears. She wasn't crying over her boyfriend anymore. She was trembling for an entirely new and far more dangerous reason. The days that followed were a strange mixture of normalcy and subliminal tension. The pain of the betrayal dissipated, just as Alessandro had predicted, becoming a colorless memory, a distant echo. What remained, vibrant and insistent, was the memory of that night in his office. It was as if a filter had been changed on her perception. Everything related to Alessandro Volkov now seemed sharper, more charged with meaning. On Tuesday, Katerina dragged her to the mansion for a movie night. They were sprawled on the sofa in the home theater, surrounded by bowls of popcorn and candy, when Alessandro came in. He was just getting home, his expensive coat slung over one arm, his expression weary. "Dad," Katerina exclaimed, pausing the movie. "Join us. We're watching that action movie you like." He glanced at the screen, then at the two of them on the sofa. His eyes met Gina's for a second, no more than the blink of an eye. But it was enough. Her heart stumbled. It was a skipped beat, a silent acknowledgement that made her feel a warmth spread through her chest. "I have work to do," he said, his voice neutral. "Enjoy yourselves, girls." He turned and went upstairs, his steps heavy and sure on the carpet. Katerina shrugged and pressed play. He's always working. But Gina could no longer focus on the film. Her ears were tuned to the sounds of the house. She heard the soft thud of the office door closing upstairs, and she found herself picturing him in there, loosening his tie, pouring himself a whiskey. The scent of leather and old paper seemed to float in the air, a sensory hallucination that was hers alone. The same thing happened the next day. Katerina and she were studying in the garden when he walked past, speaking on the phone in Russian. His voice was low, hard, the words sharp like shards of glass. Gina understood nothing, yet she understood everything. That was the Don, the man who commanded an empire as easily as he breathed. He didn't look at them, but she felt his gaze, a quick scan, an inventory. When he was gone, she realized she was gripping a pencil so tightly her knuckles ached. Meanwhile, Alessandro was fighting his own silent battle. The girl, his daughter's friend. She was supposed to be invisible to him, part of the scenery, background noise in Katerina's life. But since that night, she no longer was. He found himself watching her from his office windows, which overlooked the garden. He watched the way the sunlight caught in her brown hair, the way she furrowed her brow in concentration over a book, the genuine smile that appeared when Katerina said something funny. It was an irritation, a distraction he could not afford. He saw her not as the clumsy girl she used to be, but as the woman she was becoming. There was a stillness in her, a depth that contrasted with the bubbly energy of his own daughter. It's her age, he told himself, trying to rationalize it. She's the same age as Katerina. It's my protective instinct. But it was a lie. The way he felt when he looked at Gina had nothing paternal about it. It was something darker, more possessive. He remembered the touch of her skin, the feel of her vulnerability, and he hated himself for it, for the weakness, for the impossibility of the situation. She was the one person in the world, besides his daughter, whom he had an absolute duty to protect, and his own thoughts were putting her in danger. On Friday, exactly 1 week after the night in his office, the Volkov family had their weekly dinner. It was a tradition. Gina, as always, was invited. She chose her dress with a care that frightened her. It was a simple navy blue dress, but it hugged her curves in a way that made her feel noticed. And she was. When she came down the stairs, Alessandro was at the bottom, talking to Katerina. He looked up as she approached. His gaze swept down her, slow, deliberate, an invisible caress that set her skin on fire. His conversation faltered for a microsecond. No one else noticed. But Gina did. And she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he knew it too. The silent game had begun, and neither of them knew how to stop it. Dinner was served in the formal dining room, under the glow of a crystal chandelier that cast diamonds of light on the polished mahogany table. The sounds were muted. The soft clink of silver cutlery against porcelain, the murmur of polite conversation, Katerina's easy laugh. For Gina, however, every sound seemed amplified. every second stretched to the breaking point. She was seated across from Alessandro. Caterina, in the middle, acted as an innocent bridge over the chasm of tension forming between them. She talked animatedly about her classes, a new club that had opened downtown, a boy who had asked her out. Gina replied, smiled at the right moments, but her consciousness was split. One part of her participated in the conversation. The other was entirely focused on the man across the table. He seemed relaxed, leaning back in his chair, one hand holding a glass of red wine. But Gina saw the small things. She saw the way his fingers tightened on the stem of the glass when she laughed at something Caterina said. She saw the hard line of his jaw when her eyes met his over the rim of her own glass. The real conversation was happening in that silent space between them. When Gina bent down to retrieve the napkin that had slipped into her lap, her foot brushed against something under the table. It was the tip of his expensive leather shoe. The contact was electric, instantaneous. She sat up with a start, her heart racing. Her eyes flew to his. He was staring at her, his face an inscrutable mask, but there was a dark glint in his eyes, an acknowledgement of the accidental touch. He didn't move his foot. Neither did she. That small point of contact became the center of her universe. It was a thin, dangerous line connecting them, invisible to the rest of the world. "Gina, you're quiet today," Caterina said, oblivious to the undercurrent passing inches away from her. "Everything okay?" Gina felt a blush rise up her neck. She forced a smile. "Just a little tired. A lot of papers for class." "Dad, tell her to relax," Caterina pleaded, turning to Alessandro. "She works too hard." Alessandro's eyes remained on Gina. The shadow of a smile touched his lips. "Your friend is a focused woman, Caterina. It's an admirable quality." The way he said woman sent a shiver down Gina's spine. It wasn't casual. It was deliberate. A word that separated her from the girl Caterina still was in his eyes. Dessert was served, a chocolate mousse that Gina could barely taste. Her mouth was dry. The pressure of his foot against hers was sometimes gentle, sometimes firm, a silent pulse that dictated the rhythm of her breathing. It was madness. It was wrong. And yet, it was the most real thing she had felt in a long time. When the dinner finally ended, Gina felt exhausted, as if she had run a marathon. Caterina stood up, stretching. "I'm going to grab my laptop. I want to show you the pictures from last weekend's party." She left the room, leaving Gina and Alessandro alone. The silence that settled was different. It was no longer subtle. It was heavy, dense, charged with everything that hadn't been said over the last 2 hours. Alessandro leaned back in his chair, watching her. The predator watching its prey. "Did you enjoy the dinner, Gina?" His voice was low, a rough velvet that seemed to caress her skin. "It was lovely, Mr. Volkov. Thank you." She started to stand, desperately needing to escape the intensity of his gaze. "Don't be in such a hurry." The words stopped her, pinning her in place. He stood, circling the table slowly, each step a deliberate sound on the Persian rug. He stopped behind her chair, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. She could smell him, an intoxicating mix of red wine and power. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum. He placed his hands on her shoulders. The touch was light, almost reverent, but the weight of his hand seemed to hold her to the chair. She held her breath, her entire body tense. "You are playing with fire, Malishka," he whispered, the Russian word an intimate secret near her ear. Gina closed her eyes. His warm breath on her neck made her shiver. She couldn't form a response, couldn't think, could only feel. The power contained within him, the danger, and the overwhelming desire that bloomed in her chest, a beautiful, poisonous flower. She heard Caterina's footsteps approaching in the hallway. Panic seized her. As if he could read her mind, Alessandro's hands withdrew. When Caterina entered the room, he was already on the other side, pouring himself a cognac, the very picture of calm indifference. No one would ever know that for a moment, their world had stopped, that a line had been crossed, and that from that instant on, there was no turning back. 2 weeks passed in a torture of near touches and stolen glances. The Volkov mansion, once a refuge, had become a minefield of tension. Gina felt like a tightrope walker, desperately trying to maintain a facade of normalcy for Katerina, while every fiber of her being was attuned to Alessandro. He, in turn, had mastered the art of self-restraint. He was a master of being distant and formal in the presence of others, only to disarm her with an intense stare when he thought no one was watching. It was a cruel game, and Gina didn't know if she was the player or the prize. The opportunity came in the form of the Volkovs' annual summer party. It was an extravagant affair. Hundreds of guests filled the meticulously manicured gardens of the mansion. The music of a live orchestra floated on the warm night air, mingling with the sound of laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses. Gina felt out of place amidst so much luxury and power. The men wore suits that cost more than her college tuition, and the women dripped with jewels. Katerina was in her element, flitting from group to group like a social butterfly. Gina tried to keep up, but soon felt suffocated. She needed air. She slipped away from the crowd, finding a stone path that led to a more secluded part of the garden, near an old oak tree whose branches reached out like protective arms. The sound of the party became a distant hum. There, under the silvery light of the moon, she could finally breathe. She closed her eyes, the cool night breeze a relief on her skin. She didn't hear him approach. Her first clue was the familiar scent of woody cologne. Her eyes snapped open. Alessandro was standing a few feet away, watching her. He looked like a creature of the night in his flawless black suit, a glass of whiskey in his hand. Running from the crowd? His voice was calm, but it cut through the night's silence. "Just getting some air," she replied, her heart beginning to race. He took a step forward and then another, closing the distance between them. "Or running from me?" She didn't answer. The honesty of the question left her speechless. He stopped in front of her, so close she had to tilt her head back to look up at him. He was a mountain of darkness against the night sky. He raised his free hand, and with the backs of his fingers, traced the line of her jaw. The touch was light as a feather, but it burned like fire. "You have no idea what you're doing to me, Malishka." His voice was a rough whisper, laden with a frustration that made her tremble. Gina's body reacted on its own. She leaned into his touch, a silent yearning that was more eloquent than any words. She saw the fight in his eyes, the battle between duty and desire. And in that moment, she wanted desire to win. She needed it to win. "Maybe I do," she whispered back, the boldness surprising herself. That broke him. He dropped the whiskey glass, the sound of it shattering on the stone path muffled by the grass. He cornered her against the rough trunk of the oak tree, a hand on either side of her head, trapping her. He wasn't hurting her, but his presence was overwhelming, a cage of muscle and heat. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. His breath smelled of whiskey and desire. His dark eyes searched her face, looking for hesitation, for fear. He found none. He found only the reflection of his own hunger. "You need to stay away from me," he growled, the words a battle against his own impulses. "I am not what you think. I am the monster in the stories they tell to frighten children like you." Gina's heart was beating so hard she could hear it in her ears, a primal, tribal rhythm. The danger emanated from him in waves, but instead of repelling her, it drew her in. She didn't see a monster. She saw a man at war with himself. "I'm not a child," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. His chest rose and fell in a deep, unsteady breath. He was losing control. The steel facade he wore as armor was cracking, and she was the cause. He hated himself for it, but he couldn't step away. It was as if she were the only point of gravity in his chaotic universe. The music from the party seemed to fade away. The world shrank to that small space under the ancient oak tree, to the scent of damp earth and the warmth of their bodies, which weren't touching, but felt each other everywhere. He closed his eyes for a moment, his jaw tight. It was a moment of surrender. When he opened them again, the fight was over. All that remained was need. And then he lowered his head and kissed her. The world seemed to stop. The sound of the party, the whisper of the wind in the oak leaves, all of it was swallowed by the instant that formed between them. It wasn't a decision. It was a surrender. A silent acknowledgement that the force drawing them together was more powerful than the fear that kept them apart. He leaned in, and time bent. There was no hesitation, only the collision of months of charged silences, of glances that said more than words. It was the end of the war they had been waging against themselves. Gina felt his presence cross the air, and for the first time, she didn't want to run from what she felt. Her hands closed over the fabric of his suit jacket, seeking an anchor in the storm that was forming inside her. It was as if she were trying to stop time, to etch this moment of freefall into her memory. That gesture was a mutual confession, a story of loneliness and control, and the sudden loss of both. For Gina, it was a revelation. To be at the center of Alessandro Volkov's attention was like being in the eye of a hurricane. Terrifying, yes. But for the first time, she felt incredibly, dizzyingly alive. She was no longer the quiet, invisible friend. There, in that suspended moment, she was the force that shook the sovereign's world. Time lost all meaning. The universe shrank to that small space under the ancient tree, to his scent, which was a mixture of night and power, and to the undeniable truth that had finally caught up with them. When he finally pulled back, the space between them vibrated with a new energy. The night air felt cold, a contrast to what had just happened. Alessandro opened his eyes, and what Gina saw in them made her hold her breath. The Don's mask had fallen away. In its place was a raw vulnerability, the confusion of a man who has awakened to a reality he can no longer deny. "This," he began, his voice hoarse and unrecognizable, "shouldn't have happened." The words were a desperate attempt to rebuild the wall that had just crumbled, but they both knew it was a lie. Pandora's box had been opened. The gate, broken. Before Gina could respond, the sound of approaching laughter brought them back to reality. It was Guess, wandering through the garden. Panic seized Gina. The reality of the situation crashed down on her like a bucket of ice water. Her best friend's father, at a party, where anyone could see them. Alessandro seemed to sense her shift. In an instant, control returned to his eyes. He stepped away from her, the distance between them now a chasm. He straightened his suit jacket, an unnecessary gesture that was purely to regain his composure. "Go back to the party," he commanded, his voice once again low and controlled. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking into the shadows. "Go. Now." Without another word, Gina turned and practically ran down the stone path, her heart pounding uncontrollably, no longer from surrender, but from fear. She didn't look back. She didn't dare. As she blended back into the bright, noisy crowd, she felt like an imposter. No one could see it, but she felt marked. The memory of him still lingered in her mind, a mixture of danger and promise. On the other side of the garden, in the shadows under the oak tree, Alessandro Volkov stood motionless for a long time, his fists clenched at his sides. He had just made the biggest mistake of his life, and he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that he would make it again. The days that followed the moment in the garden were a silent torture. Gina avoided the Volkov mansion, making excuses that sounded weak even to her own ears. Katerina, thankfully, was busy with exams, and didn't perceive her friend's absence as anything more than academic stress. Gina needed distance. She needed space to process the memory of that night, which replayed in her mind in an endless loop. The rough texture of the tree bark, the deep timbre of his voice, the surrender that frightened her. Every detail was engraved in her memory. She felt guilty, scared, and to her horror, anxious for more. Alessandro, for his part, did not reach out. His silence was a statement. It was as if he were trying to erase what happened, hoping that if they ignored the fire, it would extinguish itself. But they both knew that fires like that don't go out. They just smolder beneath the surface, waiting for oxygen. The oxygen came a week later, in the form of a text message from an unknown number. "I need to speak with you, not at my house. Tomorrow, 3 p.m., address to follow." There was no name, but none was needed. The authoritative tone was unmistakable. Gina's heart leaped into her throat. Fear and a wave of excitement coursed through her body. She didn't reply. She knew she didn't have to. The message wasn't an invitation. It was a summons. The next day, a new text arrived with a downtown address. A sleek, anonymous apartment building in a neighborhood she had never been to. Gina spent hours deciding what to wear, hating herself for it. She settled on jeans and a simple sweater, wanting to appear casual, as if this wasn't the most important thing that had ever happened to her. It was a fragile lie. The apartment was on the top floor. The door was unlocked. She stepped into a silence that hummed in her ears. The place was impersonal and luxurious, with modern furniture and glass walls that offered a breathtaking view of the Chicago skyline. There were no photos, no books, no sign of life. It was a place for secrets. He was standing by the window, his back to her, watching the city. He didn't turn when she came in, but she knew he had felt her presence. "Close the door," he said, his voice calm. The sound of the lock clicking echoed in the room. Gina stood by the entrance, her hands sweating. "That was a mistake," he said, still not turning. "What happened in the garden?" "I know," she whispered, though her heart protested. "You're my daughter's best friend. You're young. I have responsibilities." He spoke the words as if they were the bars of a cage he had built himself. He finally turned to face her. His eyes were dark, his expression tense, like a man who hadn't slept in days. "Then why am I here, Alessandro?" She used his first name for the first time. The word sounded strange and intimate on her tongue. The use of his name seemed to break something in him. He crossed the room in a few long strides, the contained energy in his movements making the air vibrate. He stopped in front of her, his intense gaze sweeping her face. "Because I am a selfish man," he said, his voice a low growl. "And because since that night, I can't think of anything else." He raised a hand, and the gesture was slow, almost hesitant. Gina felt his presence cross the air, and instead of retreating, she held her ground. Her surrender was the only permission he needed. He lowered his head, and the outside world, with its rules and consequences, disappeared. This time, there was none of the anger or desperation of the first time. There was a deep, aching need. A slow, exploratory acknowledgement, full of a tenderness that surprised her. It was as if he were quenching a thirst that had been tormenting him for a long time. Her hands hesitated, then gave in, finding a place on his shoulders. There was no space, no air, only the feeling of two solitudes meeting. Katerina, the guilt, the danger, it all dissolved in that instant. There, in that anonymous apartment, they were not the Don and his daughter's friend. They were just a man and a woman, drawn together by a force they could no longer deny. He pulled back, and for an instant, the world seemed suspended. The sound of their breathing was the only thing in the room. "This is going to destroy us, Gina," he whispered, the words hanging in the air between them. "I know," she whispered back. And for the first time she realized she didn't care. The rain began to fall outside, a soft sound against the glass walls, muffling the racing heartbeats of two souls who had just sealed their forbidden fate. The safe apartment became their sanctuary, a world apart, floating above the city, where the rules of real life didn't apply. They met there once, sometimes twice a week. Each meeting was a dose of a dangerous and addictive drug. The double life began, and Gina discovered she was a surprisingly good liar. It became a matter of survival. "I have to go to the library, Kate," she would tell Katerina, her stomach churning at how easily the words came out. Huge research project. "I have a headache. I think I'll go home early," she would invent to escape a coffee date with friends. Each lie was a small cut on her conscience, but the reward was Alessandro. The anticipation of seeing him was an electric current that hummed beneath her skin constantly. The sound of her phone vibrating with a message from an unknown number, always just a time, a day, was enough to make her heart race. Alessandro was a man of dualities. In the outside world he was the sovereign, cold and ruthless. But in that apartment, with her, the walls of ice melted. Not completely, but enough for her to glimpse the man behind the dawn. He never spoke of his business. It was a line he never crossed. Instead, they talked about her. about her dreams of working in a museum in Florence, about her passion for Renaissance art. He listened to her with an intensity that made her feel like the most fascinating person in the world. No one had ever listened to her that way. He, in turn, would reveal fragments of himself in unexpected moments. One afternoon, as they watched the rain, she found him staring at the horizon with a deep melancholy. "What do you miss the most?" she asked softly. He was silent for a long time. "Anonymity," he finally answered, his voice low. The ability to walk down the street and just be a man. In that moment, he wasn't the all-powerful Alessandro Volkov. He was just a man trapped in a gilded cage of his own making. Gina felt a wave of tenderness so overwhelming it left her breathless. She reached out and laced her fingers with his. He squeezed her hand tightly, a gesture of silent gratitude. But the real world was always lurking, a constant shadow on the periphery of their secret bubble. Guilt was Gina's constant companion. Being with Katerina became torture. Every shared laugh, every secret confessed by her friend, felt like a betrayal. Katerina spoke about her father with an innocent adoration that broke Gina's heart. "Dad is so protective," Katerina said one day while they were eating ice cream. "He still thinks I'm a little girl. He'd kill me if he knew I was dating Victor." Gina almost choked. "He seems to like Victor." "Sure, to his face. But I know what he's like. He ran a background check on the poor guy back to his great-grandparents." Katerina laughed. "It's cute, I guess. It shows he cares." Gina felt a chill. She wondered what Alessandro would do if he found out about them. The image of the cold fury in his eyes terrified her. She was living a lie that could not only destroy her friendship, but also place her in a danger she could barely conceive. The constant fear of a slip-up was exhausting. A phone call at the wrong time. A name whispered in a dream. An item forgotten in the wrong place. One night, she was at the apartment with Alessandro. He was on the phone in his makeshift office, speaking in Russian, his voice low and hard. Gina was in the living room, reading an art book he had bought for her. Her phone vibrated. It was Katerina. "Where are you? Still stuck at the library? Want me to bring coffee?" Gina's heart froze. She typed a quick reply, her hands shaking. "No need. Leaving now. See you at home in an hour. Kisses." She looked around the luxurious apartment, at the man in the other room whose voice could command armies, at the view of the city that stretched below them like a carpet of diamonds. She was living in a dream. But with every lie, with every beat of her frightened heart, she wondered when the dream would turn into a nightmare. And who would pay the price when she woke up? The danger they were hiding from didn't come from a rival or an enemy. It came in the form of a caring gesture, an act of innocence that nearly destroyed everything. It was a Thursday night. Gina had told Katerina she was going to a late lecture at the university. Instead, she was at the apartment, in Alessandro's arms. A summer storm was brewing outside, the sky darkening prematurely. They were in the living room, the only sound their breathing, and the rain that was beginning to drum against the windows. Alessandro was relaxed, a rarity. He was lying on the sofa, his head in Gina's lap, while she gently ran her fingers through his hair. His eyes were closed, the dawn's facade completely gone. In these moments, he looked younger, almost vulnerable. His phone, left on the coffee table, started to vibrate. Alessandro's eyes opened, the peace of the moment shattered. He reached for it, his expression already hardening. He looked at the screen and his entire body tensed. "It's Katerina," he said, his voice low and controlled. He sat up, the movement sharp and sudden. He answered, "Da Zvezdoshka, yes, little star?" Gina held her breath, her heart pounding against her ribs. She could only hear his side of the conversation, but Katerina's worried tone was evident in the way Alessandro's expression changed. "What happened? Calm down. Where are you? No, stay there, I'm on my way." He hung up, already on his feet, grabbing his keys and wallet. The dawn was back. "What's wrong?" Gina asked, fear icing her veins. Her car has a flat tire on Lakeshore Drive. She's alone and scared. He was already moving toward the door, grabbing his coat. "I have to go." "Of course. Go," she said. The relief that Katerina was safe quickly replaced by a new kind of panic. She was here, in his apartment. Alessandro paused with his hand on the doorknob, as if the same thought had just struck him. His eyes met hers, and she saw the quick calculation, the risk assessment. "Stay here," he ordered. "Lock the door after I leave. I'll call when everything is handled." He left, closing the door with a decisive click. Gina rushed to lock it, her heart hammering. She was alone, trapped in this sanctuary that suddenly felt like a cage. She paced the living room, hugging herself, her mind racing. 20 minutes later, her phone rang. It was Alessandro. "Gina," his voice was tense, "I have a problem." "What is it? Is Katerina okay?" "She's fine. But the car? It will take at least an hour for the tow truck to arrive and change the tire. And it's raining hard." He paused. "She's coming here." Gina's world stopped. "What? Here? To the apartment?" "She was nearby. I told her I have a place I use for meetings close by. I had no choice, Gina. She was shivering from the cold. I'm bringing her here to wait." Panic, sharp and cold, pierced her. "Alessandro, no!" "They're 5 minutes away. You need to hide. The closet in my bedroom. Go now. Don't make a sound. Don't come out for any reason." The call ended. 5 minutes. Gina sprang into action, driven by adrenaline. She rushed through the living room, grabbing her purse, her coat. She checked for any stray hairs, a used glass, any sign of her presence. She ran to the bedroom, a room as impersonal as the rest of the apartment. She opened the closet door. It was spacious, filled with suits that smelled like him. She slipped inside, pulling the door shut until only a tiny crack remained, enough for her to breathe and, if she dared, to look. She huddled in the dark, his scent enveloping her as she listened, her heart beating like a trapped bird. Seconds later, she heard the key in the lock. The door opened. "Wow, Dad. What is this place?" Katerina's voice, so familiar and now so terrifying, filled the apartment. "It's so sterile." "It's just functional," Alessandro's voice replied, calm and steady. A perfect actor. Gina peeked through the crack. She saw Katerina, her hair damp with rain, and Alessandro draping a blanket over her shoulders. A fatherly gesture that made Gina's stomach churn with guilt. "I'll make some tea," he said, heading to the kitchen. Katerina sat on the sofa. And then, Gina's nightmare came true. Katerina started walking around the apartment curious. She looked out the window, touched the furniture, and she headed for the bedroom. Gina shrank back into the closet, her body rigid with terror. The bedroom door swung open. Katerina's footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor. She was meters away. Gina's heart stopped. Any sound, any movement, and it would all be over. Time contorted, each second stretching into an infinite agony. Gina held her breath until her lungs burned, convinced that the sound of her own heart would betray her. She heard the soft rustle of Katerina's clothes as she moved around the room, the click of a lamp being turned on. A sigh. Gina pictured her looking around, perhaps sitting on the edge of the bed, completely oblivious to the fact that her best friend was hidden just feet away, living the lie that would destroy her world. The guilt was a physical poison, rising in Gina's throat. She felt like the worst person on earth. A traitor. "Kate?" Alessandro's voice came from the hallway, calm, but with a thread of steel beneath it. "The tea is ready." "Coming," Katerina's voice replied, cheerfully unaware. Gina heard her footsteps moving away. The bedroom door closed with a soft click. She exhaled in a silent, shaky breath, her legs too weak to support her. She slid down the closet wall, sitting on the floor in the dark, trembling uncontrollably. The proximity of discovery had left her nauseated. Through the crack in the door, she heard fragments of their conversation in the living room. Katerina's laughter. Alessandro's monosyllabic replies. To his daughter, he was the same fortress as always. Only Gina knew the truth. Only she could feel the tension beneath his calm, the monumental effort he was making to maintain this charade. An hour felt like a lifetime. Finally, Alessandro's phone rang. "The tow truck is here," he announced. Gina heard them getting up, Katarina thanking her father for saving her. "Of course, Zvezdochka," Alessandro said. "I will always save you." The sentence hit Gina like a punch. He was protecting his daughter. And to do that, he was hiding Gina in the dark, like a dirty secret. It was the brutal reality of their situation. She would always come second. She was the sin. Katarina was the priority. The front door closed. The sound of the lock turning echoed in the silence. Gina didn't move. She remained huddled in the dark for long minutes, listening only to her own unsteady breathing. She didn't know if he would come back. She didn't know what to do. 10 minutes later, the key turned in the lock again. This time the footsteps were heavy, solitary. They were his. The bedroom door opened. The light from the hallway blinded her for a moment. He stood in the doorway, his silhouette dark and imposing. "Gina?" His voice was low, tired. She didn't answer. She just stared up at him from the closet floor. He entered the room and crouched in front of her. His eyes searched her face in the dark, seeing the silent tears that traced a path down her cheeks. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." The words would be empty. Instead, he did the only thing he could. He held out his hand and helped her up. His hands were warm and steady. He pulled her out of the closet, into the light, and wrapped her in his arms. Gina buried her face in his chest, the familiar scent of his cologne and the expensive fabric of his suit enveloping her. She didn't sob. She just clung to him, trembling, as the residual terror of the last hour finally left her. He held her tightly, one hand on her back, the other in her hair, cradling her as if she were something precious he had almost lost. "I know," he whispered against her hair. "I know." They stood there for a long time, in the silence of the room. The incident was not mentioned again. It didn't need to be. They had both felt how close they had come to the edge of the precipice. That near disaster changed something between them. The danger was no longer an abstract idea. It was real, tangible. And instead of pushing them apart, as logic would dictate, it bound them together. The shared secret, the adrenaline of the near discovery, forged a new kind of intimacy between them. They were accomplices. They were allies against the world. They knew they were playing with fire. But that night, having survived the first burn, all they felt was the irresistible need to move even closer to the flames. The bratva rarely showed itself in public, preferring to operate in the shadows. But once a year, Alessandro Volkov hosted a charity gala. It was a front, a way to launder the family's reputation with generous donations to hospitals and orphanages. For the Chicago elite, it was the social event of the season. For Alessandro, it was a night of business, a demonstration of power disguised as philanthropy. Gina went, of course. As Katarina's best friend, her absence would be noticed. She felt like an imposter in her emerald green silk dress, borrowed from Katarina. The ballroom of a luxury hotel was crowded with faces she only saw in magazines. And at the center of it all, like the sun around which all planets orbited, was Alessandro. He was magnificent. In a black tuxedo that seemed molded to his body, he moved through the room with a lethal grace, shaking hands, smiling smiles that didn't reach his eyes, exuding an aura of power that was almost palpable. His eyes met hers across the crowd only once. It was a quick, possessive glance that made her feel as if they were the only two people in the room, a silent promise that, later, he would be hers. Gina tried to stay close to Katarina, using her as a shield, but her friend was soon swept away by a group of socialites. Gina found herself alone near the bar, feeling small and invisible. That's when a man approached. He was older, with graying hair and a smile that seemed oily. Gina vaguely recognized him as Dmitry Petrov, one of Alessandro's supposed business associates. A man Katarina had always said gave her the creeps. "Well, well. Katarina's little friend," Petrov said, his voice slick. "Lost, little dove?" "I'm fine, thank you," Gina replied politely, taking a step back. He took a step forward, invading her personal space. The smell of brandy on his breath was strong. "You're much prettier than the boss's daughter. Does he keep you around for entertainment?" The comment was crude, Humiliating. A flush of anger and shame rose up Gina's neck. "Excuse me, I have to go." She tried to turn away, but he grabbed her by the arm. The grip was firm. "Don't be in such a hurry. Let's have a drink." Panic began to bubble in Gina's chest. She looked around for help, but everyone was absorbed in their own conversations. "Please let me go." "Or what?" he sneered. And then a voice cut through the party's noise, a voice so cold it could freeze hell. "Or you will find out just how flexible your fingers really are." Dmitri Petrov froze. He turned slowly. Alessandro was standing behind him. He wasn't yelling. He didn't look angry. He looked calm. And that calm was the most terrifying thing Gina had ever seen. Petrov's smile faltered. "Alessandro, we were just talking." "Let her go," Alessandro said, the words low and precise. Petrov dropped Gina's arm as if it were on fire. Alessandro stepped forward, placing himself between Gina and the other man. He put a protective hand on the small of Gina's back, a gesture that told everyone in the room, "She is mine." His eyes never left Petrov's. "Apologize to the lady." Petrov swallowed hard, sweat shining on his forehead. He turned to Gina. My apologies, miss. I meant no offense." "Now," Alessandro continued, his voice still dangerously soft, "get out of my party. And tomorrow, at 8 a.m, be at my office. We are going to have a talk about respect." Dmitri Petrov turned pale. He nodded quickly and disappeared into the crowd. Alessandro turned to Gina. The cold fury in his eyes was replaced by intense concern. He scanned her face, then glanced at the arm where Petrov had held her. "Did he hurt you?" "No," she whispered, her body still trembling. "I'm fine." He guided her away from the bar, to a secluded balcony overlooking the city lights. The night was cool, but she didn't feel it. Adrenaline was still coursing through her veins. He took off his tuxedo jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The fabric was still warm with his body heat. "I shouldn't have brought you here," he said, his voice filled with a self-loathing that shocked her. "This world, it's not for you." "It wasn't your fault," she said, her voice stronger now. He turned to her, his face hardened with guilt. "Everything that happens under my roof, under my protection, is my fault." He raised a hand and brushed her cheek with his knuckles. "Seeing the fear in your eyes, it made me want to kill him with my bare hands." The raw confession left her breathless. In that moment, she saw the beast. The monster he had warned her about, the predator that lived just beneath the surface of his impeccable control, and instead of feeling fear, she felt an overwhelming sense of belonging. That beast would protect her. That beast would keep her safe. She leaned in and kissed him, right there on the balcony, not caring who might see. It was a quick, desperate kiss, full of gratitude and something deeper, something she didn't yet have the courage to name. He pulled away, glancing at the glass door that led back to the party. "We need to go back. Katerina will notice." But before they returned to the light, he pulled her close one last time, his face buried in her hair. "You are mine, Gina," he whispered. The words not a declaration of love, but a promise of ownership. "And I protect what is mine." Alessandro's talk with Dmitri Petrov had swift and silent consequences. No one spoke of it, but in the following week, Petrov was no longer seen in Bratva circles. There were whispers that he had retired abruptly and moved to another state. Gina didn't ask. She didn't want to know the bloody details of the kind of protection Alessandro offered. It was enough to know that the threat had been neutralized, erased from her life as if it had never existed. The incident, however, left a mark on them. There was a new gravity to their meetings. The danger had become real, and with it, Alessandro's need to keep her safe became almost an obsession. He insisted on sending a discreet car to pick her up for their meetings, rather than letting her take a taxi. He gave her a new phone, a secure phone, with only one number in the contacts, his. Gina accepted it all without question. Each protective gesture, no matter how controlling, felt like a substitute for the words of affection he never spoke. One rainy afternoon, a few weeks after the gala, they were in the apartment. Gina was sitting on the floor, her back against the sofa where he sat, flipping through an art book he had given her. Alessandro was quiet, working on his laptop, but she felt his gaze on her from time to time. She was looking at a Caravaggio painting, at the dramatic interplay of light and shadow, when she noticed the scar on his hand. He was resting his arm on the back of the sofa, and the light from the window illuminated a jagged white line that ran across his knuckles. She had seen it before, but she had never really looked. Without thinking, she reached out and traced the pale line with her fingertip. The skin was smooth, old. His body tensed at the unexpected touch. He stopped typing. Gina looked up, expecting him to pull away. He didn't. He just watched her, his face inscrutable. "How did this happen?" she asked, her voice a whisper. He hesitated. It was a door to his past, a past he kept under lock and key. Gina expected him to brush her off with a vague answer, but to her surprise, he relaxed his body and turned his hand over, allowing her to examine it. "A reminder," he said, his voice low, "that loyalty is the most expensive commodity in the world, and the rarest." He didn't give details, but the bitterness in his voice told its own story. A story of betrayal. "Do you trust anyone?" she dared to ask. His dark eyes met hers, and for a moment, the Don's mask fell. She saw the weight of his world, the loneliness of a man at the top, surrounded by sharks. "I trusted my wife," he said, and the mention of her hung in the air between them. He rarely spoke of her. Gina knew only the basics. Her name was Anya. She had died young, years ago, and Katerina was her spitting image. "What was she like?" Gina asked softly, afraid to break the fragile moment. Alessandro looked away, focusing on the rain streaking down the window pane. "She was light," he said, the word heavy with old pain. "She saw the good in everyone, even when there was none to be found. She was stubborn, passionate. She challenged me. She made me better." He closed his hand, hiding the scar. The moment of vulnerability had passed. Gina felt a pang of something she couldn't identify. It wasn't jealousy of a dead woman. It was a deep sadness for him, for the man he might have been if he hadn't lost his light. She stood up, knelt on the sofa beside him, and on an impulse, kissed the hand he had clenched into a fist, right over the hidden scar. It was a gesture of pure comfort, an attempt to soothe a pain she could barely comprehend. He watched her, his face a mixture of surprise and something deeper. He raised his other hand and caressed her cheek, his thumb brushing softly against her skin. "You are dangerous, Gina," he murmured. "Why?" "Because you make me remember." He didn't say what. He didn't have to. She understood. She reminded him of a time before the walls of ice had been erected around his heart, and she represented the greatest threat to those walls. He leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of overwhelming passion, but of deep emotional connection. It was slow, tender, almost painful in its intimacy. In that kiss, there were no secrets, no lies, no mafia. There were only the scars of a man and the woman who dared to touch them. In that moment, Gina knew. She knew with a terrifying, unshakable certainty. She wasn't just in love with her best friend's father. She loved him. Love, once acknowledged, was impossible to ignore. It colored every interaction, every glance, every touch. Their relationship, which had begun in the darkness of desire and secrecy, was now illuminated by something far more dangerous: genuine emotion. Gina saw the change in Alessandro too. He had become softer with her, the moments of tenderness more frequent. He watched her with an intensity that seemed to look straight into her soul. But love also brought a new weight. The impossibility of their future was a ghost that haunted every happy moment. The tension came to a head one autumn evening. They weren't in the safe apartment. Alessandro had taken her to dinner at a small, exclusive restaurant tucked away in an alley, a place where no one would recognize them. It was the closest they had ever come to a normal date. But normalcy was an illusion. Throughout the dinner, Gina felt the weight of what they were doing. The lie seemed to be sitting at the table with them. Afterward, he didn't take her home. He drove, aimlessly, through the dark city streets. The light rain created a cocoon of intimacy inside the luxury car. He finally pulled over at a lookout point overlooking Lake Michigan, the city lights twinkling in the distance like fallen stars. He cut the engine. The silence in the car was thick. "We can't keep doing this, can we?" Gina's voice was quiet, barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. Alessandro didn't look at her. He kept staring at the city. His jaw was tight. "I know." "What are we doing, Alessandro?" she asked, her voice trembling with the weight of the question. "We hide, we lie. Where does this go?" "Don't ask me about the future, Gina," he said, his voice harsh. "I don't have a future to offer you." The words were brutal in their honesty. They were the truth she had tried to ignore. He was the dawn of the Bratva. His life was mapped out by violence, duty, and danger. There was no place in it for his daughter's secret lover. The tears she had been holding back finally escaped, sliding silently down her face. "I love you," she whispered. The confession slipped out before she could stop it. A painful and liberating truth. Alessandro's entire body went rigid. He slowly turned his head to face her in the dim light of the car. His eyes were dark, filled with an emotion she couldn't decipher. It was pain, anger, regret. "Don't say that," he said, his voice a low growl. "Don't you dare say that." "It's true." He slammed his fist against the steering wheel, the muffled sound of violent shock in the silence. "You don't understand. You don't know what you're saying. Love, in my world, is a weapon your enemies use against you. It's a weakness. It's a death sentence." He turned to her, his face a mask of agony. "I should have stayed away from you from the very first day. I should have been stronger." He reached out and wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb. His touch was reverent. "You've become a weakness I can no longer afford," he said, his voice breaking. "But letting you go is impossible." It was his confession. It wasn't an "I love you." It was something rawer, more desperate. It was the acknowledgement of a man who saw himself as both her protector and her greatest danger. He loved her enough to know he should let her go, but he was too selfish to be able to. He leaned in, capturing her lips in a kiss that had nothing tender about it. It was desperate, hungry, a kiss that spoke of stolen futures and inevitable pain. It was the kiss of two lovers at a crossroads, knowing that whichever path they chose would lead to destruction. When they pulled apart, the truth hung between them, bare and undeniable. They loved each other, and that love would lead them straight into the heart of the storm. Little did they know the storm was about to break, and that the first drop of rain would be a small silver object, forgotten in the wrong place. The world continued to turn, oblivious to the time bomb Gina and Alessandro had set. Their confession in the dark car didn't change their circumstances, but it deepened the stakes. Every secret meeting was now tinged with the painful sweetness of stolen time, the awareness that each kiss could be the last. The mistake, when it happened, was trivial. A lapse in attention born of the comfort and familiarity they had built in their secret bubble. It was a Saturday afternoon. Gina and Alessandro had spent hours at the apartment, a rare, unhurried period of tranquility. It was raining outside, and they stayed in bed, talking, laughing, existing in a universe that was only theirs. Gina was wearing a delicate silver bracelet, a thin chain with a small sun charm. It had been a birthday gift from Katerina the year before. "For my friend who is a ray of sunshine, even on Chicago's cloudy days," the card had read. The clasp of the bracelet was bothering her. She took it off and placed it on the nightstand beside the bed, planning to put it back on before she left. But she forgot. When she left the apartment hours later, the bracelet remained, a small silver circle gleaming discreetly on the dark wood, a silent bomb waiting to detonate. 2 days later, Katerina was having a bad day. A low grade on a test, an argument with her boyfriend. Needing her father, she decided to surprise him, bringing his favorite coffee to his satellite office, the nickname she'd given the safe apartment he rarely used. Alessandro had given her an emergency key long ago, telling her it was a safe place if she ever needed it. She had never used it. until today. She let herself into the quiet apartment, calling out for her father. There was no answer. Assuming he was in a meeting, she decided to wait. She left the coffee in the kitchen, and out of curiosity, began to wander around the place. She went into the bedroom. The bed was perfectly made, the curtains drawn. Everything was immaculate, anonymous, except for one thing. On the nightstand, something glinted, catching the dim light. Katerina moved closer. Her heart gave a small leap of recognition. It was the sun bracelet, the bracelet she had given Gina. For a moment, confusion reigned. What is Gina's bracelet doing here? She picked it up, the metal cold in her palm. Maybe Gina had lost it, and her father had found it and kept it safe. It made no sense. And then, like the pieces of a terrible puzzle clicking into place, the fragments of memory began to connect. Gina's sudden absences, the flimsy excuses, the strange way her father sometimes looked at her, the tension in the air she had felt but couldn't name. No, it couldn't be. It was her father. It was her best friend. It was impossible. Katerina sat on the edge of the bed, the bracelet clenched in her fist. The reality was a wave of nausea rising in her throat. She thought about the night her tire had gone flat, how her father had brought her to this very apartment. Gina was supposed to be at a lecture. Another lie. Had she been here? Hiding? The image was so monstrous, so grotesque, that her mind refused to accept it. But the bracelet in her hand was cold, undeniable proof. The silence of the apartment was deafening. Every shadow seemed to mock her. Every corner seemed to hold the secret of their betrayal. The two people she loved most in the world, the two rocks of her life, had stabbed her in the back. Together. The tears didn't come. In their place came an icy chill that spread through her veins, freezing her heart. The pain was so sharp, so deep, it transcended crying. It was a pain that breaks. She stood up. With stiff, deliberate movements, she threw the untouched coffee in the trash. She walked to the door, still gripping the bracelet so tightly the charm dug into her skin. She wasn't going to confront them here, not in this place desecrated by their betrayal. She would do it at her home, on her territory. She left the apartment, closing the door with a soft click. The sound echoed like the closing of a coffin. The coffin of her innocence, her friendship, her family. The storm was no longer gathering. It had arrived. Gina was in the library of the Volkov mansion with Katerina, trying to help her with an art history paper. It was a scene that had played out hundreds of times over the years. The two of them surrounded by books, the smell of old paper in the air. But on this day, everything was wrong. Katerina was strangely quiet. There was a tension in her shoulders, a sharp edge to her voice that Gina had never heard before. She answered in monosyllables, her eyes fixed on her laptop screen, avoiding Gina's gaze. "Kate, is everything okay?" Gina finally asked, anxiety building in her stomach. "You seem upset." Katerina stopped typing. She slowly raised her head, and the eyes that met Gina's were those of a stranger. They were cold, hard, and filled with a pain so deep that Gina instinctively recoiled. "I know," Katerina said, her voice low and emotionless. Gina's blood ran cold. "Nope, what?" Instead of answering, Katerina opened the hand she had kept clenched at her side. In her palm lay the small silver bracelet, glimmering under the library lamplight like a piece of evidence. Gina's world fell apart. The air was sucked from her lungs. The sound vanished, replaced by a high-pitched ringing in her ears. There was no possible denial. There was no escape. "Where?" Gina's voice was a thread. "In the apartment," Katerina answered, the word apartment dripping with venom. "On the nightstand. His." At that moment, Alessandro walked into the library. He had just come home and was looking for his daughter. He stopped in the doorway, sensing the icy atmosphere in the room. He saw Gina's pale face, his daughter's broken gaze, and the bracelet in her hand. And he knew. The time for lies was over. "Dad," Katerina said, without taking her eyes off Gina. "Glad you could join us. I think we have a family matter to discuss." Alessandro entered the room, closing the doors behind him. The sound was final, trapping the three of them in that room with the ugly truth. Caterina finally turned to her father. The tears she had been holding back now streamed freely, silent and full of fury. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Her? Of all the people in the world. Her?" "Caterina!" Alessandro began, his voice hoarse. "No!" she screamed, the word exploding in the silent room. She shot to her feet, her body trembling with rage and pain. She threw the bracelet on the floor, between Gina and Alessandro. The small silver object clattered on the polished wood, the only sound in the room. "You brought her into our home. You had her sit at our table. You lied to me every single day." She turned to Gina, her face contorted by betrayal. "And you, my best friend, my sister. How could you look me in the eye? How could you sleep at night?" "Kate, I'm so sorry," Gina sobbed, the words inadequate, pathetic. "You're sorry?" Caterina laughed, a horrible broken sound. "You're not sorry. You're just sorry you got caught. You stole my father." "This isn't her fault," Alessandro intervened, his voice firm, trying to draw the fire to himself. "This is my responsibility. I am the adult. I am to blame." "To blame?" Caterina spun on him, her eyes blazing. "You're more than to blame. You're a monster. My mother. What would she say if she saw this? You've desecrated her memory with this." The mention of his late wife hit Alessandro like a physical blow. He flinched, the pain visible on his face. "I loved you more than anything," Caterina continued, her voice now choked with grief. "I idolized you, and you destroyed everything. You both destroyed the only pure thing in my life." She looked from one to the other, at their pale, guilty faces. "I want you both out of my life," she said, each word a verdict. "Get out of my house," she said to Gina. "And you," she looked at her father. "I don't know what you are to me anymore." She turned and stormed out of the library, slamming the doors with a force that made the books tremble on the shelves. The silence she left behind was an abyss. Gina was sobbing, her body bent with grief and shame. Alessandro stood motionless, a statue, his face a mask of agony. The silver bracelet still gleamed on the floor between them, a little sun that had been completely eclipsed by the darkness they had created themselves. The storm hadn't just arrived. It had destroyed everything in its path. The days following the discovery were a silent hell. Gina packed her bags and left the mansion that same night, without saying goodbye, moving like a ghost through the house that had once been her second home. She returned to her small student apartment, a place that suddenly felt cold and foreign, an exile from her own life. Caterina locked herself in her room, refusing to speak to Alessandro. The communication between father and daughter, once so easy, was reduced to notes passed by staff and closed doors. The Volkov mansion, always so full of life, became a mausoleum, heavy with the weight of unspoken words and broken hearts. Alessandro and Gina did not speak. The secure phone remained silent. They were both grieving, isolated in their own pain, knowing that any attempt at contact would only deepen Caterina's wound. Devastated by the pain he had caused his daughter, the one person he had sworn to protect, Alessandro made the decision he knew was the only right one, no matter how much it tore his soul apart. He went to Gina's apartment. When she opened the door, the sight of him took her breath away. He looked as if he had aged 10 years. There were dark circles under his eyes, and the armor of control he always wore was full of cracks. "We can't," he said, his voice hoarse, without even stepping inside. "This ends here, Gina. I can't lose her. I can't destroy my family completely." Every word was a stab to Gina's heart, but she saw the agonizing truth in his eyes. He was making a choice, and he was not choosing her. "I understand," she whispered, the lump in her throat making it nearly impossible to speak. She was being brave, accepting the sacrifice. Inside, she was disintegrating. "Goodbye, Gina." He turned and walked away, without looking back. Gina closed the door and slid to the floor, finally allowing the sobs she had been holding back to consume her. Their love, which had seemed so powerful, had been broken by reality. As the Volkov family fractured, their enemies watched from the shadows. Discord was a weakness, and the Bratva did not forgive weakness. Dmitry Petrov, the man Alessandro had humiliated, had not retired. He had been exiled, stripped of his power, and he burned with the desire for revenge. He had been watching Gina for weeks, knowing the girl was the key to Alessandro's ruin. And now, with the family in chaos, it was the perfect time to strike. 2 days after the breakup, Gina was walking home from the university at night. The streets were dark, damp with rain. She was so lost in her own misery that she didn't notice the black van that slowed down beside her. She didn't notice the 2 men who got out until it was too late. A hand covered her mouth, muffling her scream. She was dragged into the van, the door slamming shut into darkness. It all happened in seconds. Hours later, Alessandro's phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Volkov," said a voice he recognized with a chill of hatred. "Dmitry Petrov. I've missed you." Alessandro's blood ran cold. "Petrov, you've made a fatal mistake." "I don't think so," Petrov sneered. "I think you're the one who made the mistake, getting attached to things you can't protect. I have something that belongs to you. The little artist. So pretty, so fragile." A blind primal fury seized Alessandro. "If you touch a hair on her head, I will hunt you to the ends of the earth and—" "Blah, blah, blah," Petrov cut him off. "Save your threats. You're going to do exactly as I say, and you're going to come alone, or the next time you see her it will be in pieces." Petrov sent an address an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district. Alessandro hung up, his body trembling with a rage so intense it made him dizzy. He knew it was a trap. He knew Petrov had no intention of letting him leave alive. But he didn't care. His life meant nothing if Gina wasn't safe. He grabbed his gun. But before he left, he did something he hadn't done in days. He knocked on Katerina's bedroom door. "Katerina, open the door. It's an emergency." There was silence. "Please," he said, his voice breaking. "I need you." The door opened slowly. Katerina stood there, her face pale and tear-stained. She looked at her father, at the gun in his hand, at the desperation in his eyes. "They have her," Alessandro said, his voice low and tense. "Petrov, he has her. And it's my fault." He quickly explained what happened at the gala, Petrov's humiliation, the motive for revenge. "He's using her to get to me. I have to go get her." Katerina stared at him, the conflict plain on her face. The anger she felt for Gina warred with a genuine concern she couldn't erase. "I'm going alone," Alessandro said. "But if I'm not back in 2 hours, I want you to call this number." He handed her a piece of paper. "It's my second-in-command, Ivan. Tell him what happened. He'll know what to do." He turned to leave, but Katerina's voice stopped him. "Don't be stupid, Dad." Alessandro turned, surprised. "You can't go alone," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. "You said he wants revenge. It's an obvious trap. He'll kill you." "I have no choice." "Yes, you do," she insisted. She glanced at Ivan's number. "Call him now. Take your men. Use your head, not your heart." She paused, swallowing her pride. She wouldn't want you to die for her. In that moment, looking at his daughter, Alessandro saw the strength of his late wife, the practicality, the courage. Katerina, despite her pain and betrayal, was thinking clearly. She was trying to save his life, and by extension, Gina's. He looked at the desperation on his daughter's face, a desperation that mirrored his own. She hated him for what he'd done, but she didn't want him to die. In that instant, the first crack appeared in the ice between them. He nodded, reaching for his phone. "You're right." He called Ivan. The hunt had begun. But now, it wasn't just the Don going to war. It was a father, propelled by the newfound strength of his daughter. The rescue was brutal, swift, and merciless. Alessandro and his most loyal men stormed the warehouse with the precision of a military force. The shootout was brief. The Bratva didn't take prisoners. Alessandro found Gina tied to a chair in a cold room in the back. She was terrified, but unharmed. When Petrov used her as a human shield, Alessandro didn't hesitate. A single shot, precise and final. The moment he cut the ropes and pulled her into his arms, the outside world ceased to exist. There was only the overwhelming relief of having her safe, the scent of her hair, the tremor of her body against his. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I've got you. You're safe." Back at the mansion, the atmosphere was different. The adrenaline of the danger had cleansed the air of the poison of silence. Katerina was waiting in the entrance hall. When she saw Gina, pale and trembling but safe, beside her father, a complex emotion crossed her face. Relief, resentment, confusion. Gina stopped in front of her. "Kate, Don't," Katerina interrupted, her voice soft. She looked at her father, who was watching them both with a pained expression. "I saw the way he looked when he thought he was going to lose you. I've never seen him like that. Not even when Mom—" She couldn't finish the sentence. She turned back to Gina. "What you two did was wrong. It destroyed the image I had of you both. It destroyed our friendship." The words were harsh, but the fire of anger was gone. There was only a deep sadness. "I don't know if I can forgive you. Not now. Maybe never." She paused, taking a deep breath. "But I don't want him to die. And I don't want you to die either." It was the closest thing to a white flag she could offer. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a beginning. It was the acknowledgement that, beneath the betrayal, there was still love, however broken it was. "I need time," Katerina said, before heading up the stairs, leaving them alone in the silence of the hall. Months passed. Life found a new, fragile normal. Gina moved into a new, secure apartment, provided by Alessandro. They were together, no longer in secret, but discreetly. Their relationship was no longer feverish and clandestine, but quiet and solid, forged in the fire of danger and loss. The relationship with Katerina was a slow, painful reconstruction. There were hesitant phone calls, tense coffees on neutral ground. The easy laughter didn't return, but the hostility was replaced by a cautious effort. The friendship they'd had was dead. But maybe, from the ashes, something new could grow. Something more honest, more adult. One spring evening, a year after the discovery, Gina was on the balcony of Alessandro's apartment. Not the safe apartment, but his real home. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her as they watched the city lights. "Katerina called me today," he said, his voice calm in her ear. "She was accepted into the exchange program, in Florence." Gina smiled, a pang of sadness and hope in her heart. Florence, her dream city. Maybe one day she would go too. She asked me if you could give her some tips on museums to visit. The meaning behind those words was immense. It was a bridge being built, a small olive branch extended across a battlefield. Gina turned in his arms, her face tilted up to his. The scars of the past year were still there, on both of them, but they had survived. "You never told me you loved me," she whispered in the quiet of the night. Alessandro looked at her, his dark eyes no longer guarded, but open, vulnerable. He bent his head and kissed her, a kiss full of silent promises and the peace they had fought so hard to find. When he pulled away, he kept his forehead pressed to hers. "I walked through hell for you, Gina," he said, his voice full of a raw emotion. "If that's not love, then I don't know what is." And for her, that was more than enough. Their love was not a fairy tale. It was born from sin, tested by fire, and had survived on the ashes of everything they had destroyed. It was a flawed, scarred love, but it was real, and it was theirs.